Two white men, one from America and the other from England, met in the heart of equatorial Africa, on the shores of Lake Tanganyika, November 10, 1871. This was their first meeting. The Englishman had been lost to the outside world for more than 2 years, and the American had been looking for him since the early part of 1871. Finally, after many great difficulties and perils, the American found the lost explorer, surrounded by his black guards, friends, and companions. They had dimly heard of each other through the vague rumors of the natives for months past, and now meeting face to face, the American, lifting his cap, said, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." The Englishman nodded an affirmative reply, and the other said, "I am Henry M. Stanley." It was in this simple yet dramatic way that two of the most famous African travelers of modern times met in the heart of the Dark Continent. Quite as dramatic, perhaps, was the departure of Stanley in pursuit of Livingstone. Stanley was not widely known previous to his expedition to Africa in search of Livingstone. He had served as a war correspondent of one of the great New York newspapers for several years and was known to his craft as a faithful, accurate, and courageous newspaper correspondent. He had dared many dangers and had encountered and overcome obstacles that would have dismayed a less intrepid soul. In 1868, he served the New York Herald as correspondent during the war in Abyssinia, which raged between the British and King Theodore. It was here he got his first taste of African adventure. It was not a long war. The British shut up King Theodore in the fortress of Magdala, where he perished miserably by his own hand in the flames of his burning citadel. Thence Stanley went to Spain, where a great civil war had broken out, and he witnessed the sacking of cities, the prosecution of sieges and battles large and small innumerable. This war over, in the autumn of 1869, the civilized world was wondering whether Dr. Livingstone, the African missionary and explorer, were dead or alive. Dr. Livingstone, who was of Scottish birth and was in the service of the London Missionary Society, had been long laboring in South Africa, a country of which the outer world then knew but very little. Along the coast here and there were points occupied temporarily by white traders and travelers, but the interior of the Dark Continent was known only through the tales of the slave catchers, who brought to the coast the black people they had gathered like so many cattle in the interior. Dr. Livingstone was doing what he could to spread the light of the Christian religion through those benighted regions. His first departure into the interior of Africa was from Cape Town in 1840, and for more than 33 years he spent his life in the arduous work to which he had consecrated himself. In 1858 he had returned to England and published a book giving an account of his missionary labors and his discoveries, and, liberally provided with means, he returned to Africa to carry on his work. He was accompanied by his wife, who died in the interior of Africa in 1862. In 1863, he returned to England and published a second book, giving some further account of his explorations. Again in 1865, he returned to Africa, and for more than a year no word came from him, but there ran a rumor that he had been killed by the savages. Early in 1869, however, letters from Dr. Livingstone, written a year before, were received on the coast, showing that he was alive and well. He had traveled many thousands of miles, being the first white man that had ever penetrated those dark and mysterious regions in the heart of Africa. But now, in the autumn of 1869, more than 20 months had passed since any word of his had come out of the darkness, and the world was ready to believe that the faithful missionary and explorer had dared his fate too often and had died in the jungles of Africa. It was at this time that Stanley, resting after a long and arduous campaign in Spain, received from James Gordon Bennett, who was then in Paris, a telegram summoning him to an interview in that city. Arriving at the French capital early in the morning, Stanley went straight to Mr. Bennett's lodgings before that gentleman had risen from his bed. In answer to his knock, a voice commanded him to enter. The two men had not met in many years. Stanley was bronzed and aged by sun and storm, and Bennett, surprised, abruptly asked, "Who are you?" "I am Stanley, and I have come to answer your message," was the reply. Bennett motioned Stanley to a seat, and after a moment's pause asked, "Will you go to Africa and find Livingstone?" Stanley was startled. For a moment he reflected, then he replied, "I will." and before he left the room his agreement with Bennett was practically concluded and some of the larger details of the expedition were mapped out, and Stanley left the hotel clothed with a commission to find Livingstone and promised all needed funds for expenses and for the relief of the great African explorer. Should he be in need, as it was expected, he would be found, if at all. Stanley first went to the east coast of Africa, where he arrived in the early part of 1871. Months were consumed at Zanzibar in making ready the expedition with which he was to penetrate into the interior. Several caravans or trains were dispatched, one after the other, loaded with ammunition, arms, provisions, and the necessaries of life, and with a large supply of goods with which to purchase a right-of-way through hostile or unfriendly kingdoms and states. Bringing up the rear of these various trains, Stanley and his armed force left the coast of Africa, March 21, 1871. He had with him 192 persons, and as he launched out into the untraveled places of Africa, 2 words rang in his ears: "Find Livingstone." Enduring many hardships, sometimes fighting and sometimes coaxing the natives, Stanley pressed on his way, his general course being in a northwesterly direction, signs, rumors, and perhaps instincts leading him to believe that Livingstone, if found alive, would be discovered somewhere in the region of Lake Tanganyika. It would be impossible to describe the vagueness and mysteriousness of the rumors which float to and fro in an untraveled and savage country, but as the intrepid adventurer pressed on, he heard more and more credible reports of the lost white man. His first convincing intimation of his being near Livingstone was when a black met him and, speaking to him in tolerably good English, told him that a white man was said to be in a village nearby. This man was one of Dr. Livingstone's servants, and soon the two, one from America and the other from England, met at Ujiji on the shores of the lake. Stanley remained with Livingstone until March 14th of the following year, busied with explorations of the fascinating region into which he had penetrated. He supplied Livingstone with all of the goods that he could spare, and on his return to Zanzibar, he sent him a caravan with men, supplies, and such articles as he needed, fulfilling the orders of Mr. Bennett. Stanley never again saw Livingstone in life. Livingstone died of malarial fever contracted in the African marshes, and his faithful servants embalmed his body and carried it to the coast hundreds of miles, bringing with them every article belonging to the missionary, even to the smallest scraps of paper on which were penned the last notes of his journey which he ever wrote. Livingstone was buried with grand ceremony in Westminster Abbey, and Stanley was one of those who bore him to his grave.